So debt and imbalances, and everybody seems to be interested in Ireland, with the poster boys, of going over the edge. Severe over-indebtedness, variable ease deflation, barely begun the fall, next wave of defaults. Well, next wave of defaults, in Ireland, there's all of these mortgages that haven't, they're effectively being kept on. If you pay a cent on your mortgage, they'll say it's operational, okay? Nobody wants to pull the plug. We have a huge personal debt. If you take Irish total indebtedness, all right, it's over 10 times GDP. And we have a budget deficit, excluding the bank bailout, which makes it 30-something% this year, of about 10 or 11%. And as you probably heard, bonds were trading at up to 9% 2 days ago. 10-year bonds, I think there were. So anybody looking at that would kind of know, there's only one way. Now they're doing austerity, and we've been doing it for a while. We're also saying, the exports are going to get us out. But every bloody country on the planet is all saying we're all going to be exporting. So, we can't all sort of make our zillions from that. We don't have to go back to the markets until March or April, because we're more or less fully funded until then. But we will probably have to go back then. At the moment, it will be the IMF as a junior partner coming in. It's most likely going to be the European Union who will try and shore it up at least for 5 minutes. Conventional QE, I'm talking about here in the US or in Britain, where they've supposedly QE'd 200 billion. It's a confidence trick, but I don't mean that I mean it in the broad sense of, it's what we do to make ourselves feel confident. So it's all its meanings there. Imbalances imply toxic codependencies. Now, just little old Ireland. If Ireland does a full default on all its bank debt, German banks are down to the tune of a third of Ireland's GDP. Okay? Now, French and German banks are up to their hock in Spanish debt, in Eastern European debt, in all sorts of debt. China, I'm always surprised when people talk about peak oil, that they kind of assume that China just keeps going. Remember, China itself is part of the globalized economy and is dependent upon it. So it too is going to feel the force of its collapse. But for the moment, for the US, China needs its workers working and producing. And when Europe starts to go under, and then the US and other countries, China is going to have incredible headaches. So peak oil economics even apart. So we're in a deflationary period now. Peak oil would be deflationary because it stops you growing and it starts to make debts more and more difficult to pay off. But it may not be noticed, and this is one of my fears. I'd like people to think this is a peak oil food ecological problem rather than a problem caused by bankers, as how the popular mind might construe such things. Why? Because blame isn't a great thing. We need a narrative that people can say, well, we all screwed up. And it just makes things easier for people to move forward. Demand may fall deeply and even real prices. Peak oil and peak energy, I don't think we're going to be, I think we probably already have most of the renewable energy infrastructure in terms of wind turbines that we will ever see on the planet. Likewise, I think we're going to see actually major degradation of a lot of other types of energy infrastructure. But food, again, has the greatest price support. Because, firstly, I think it's going to fall quite a bit. But unlike turning off a factory, when we turn off food, you start to have a real crisis. We just do not have, I think, the slack. And it will be, I think, where the greatest price support is. Eventually, you can't do deflation forever. And remember, talking about globally, US might hang on for longer, but like other countries are going to start reissuing currency, hyperinflating, doing all sorts of things. It's going to be a much more difficult market to read. I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about or trying to get talked about in Europe is what you might call unconventional quantitative easing, which is where we give everybody in Europe per capita money into their hand effectively, and we tell, and the deal is, if you owe money, you use it to pay it off. If you don't, that's fine. Now, it causes inflation. People with small balances are partially compensated with the inflation because they're getting the money into their hands and other people are wiped. And that is an idea. I know Richard, my colleague, has been arguing for it, and there's some people, I don't know if it's the Kansas Fed, Mosler, and others, I don't know if you know them, they've been talking about it as well. But the real problem ultimately isn't debt-based money. It's part of our problem, but fiat currency is a problem. Why is fiat currency a problem? Well, if you start to see we're going down, there are also risks of infrastructure collapse. There are risks of less food. There are risks of things falling apart. And we all have the same amount of money, and it's all not debt-based. Or we could all print money, each of you, to whatever degree. It sets up the conditions where we start either stealth printing or going for a grab for whatever is left before the thing starts to collapse. And, how that pans out, I'm not quite sure. But it's effectively one of those things where if more people start to think that others might do it, it increases the risk that they might do it. And one of the early things, I think, is bank intermediation failure, and we barely avoided that. Financing credit, loss of global economies of scale. All of these things start to jump in. But ultimately, if you lose that trust over currencies, you lose our supply chains. And you lose the ability to enforce things as well. Now, this is not the original slide, but I just want to talk a bit about critical infrastructure risk. We said before that it's the most complex stuff. It's built for a growth economy at this scale, so it takes a little bit of money from all of us to pay for it. Well, if there's less and less economic activity, and we can't afford it. We stop using our mobile phones, or we use them very rarely, or I borrow yours. We collectively use them. Or factories stop using the sewerage system that they're paying rates for. Or, and we've started a research project a bit on this, which I'll mention, which is, if you think in Europe, you've got pipelines coming from Russia all the way across Europe for gas. Then they get to the countries, and they go into power stations. And then they go from power stations onto grids. So there's the fuel, and there's this big fixed operating cost. Okay? What happens if fewer and fewer people can afford it? We're assuming money has stability at the moment, okay, that we could still use it. Fewer and fewer people can afford to pay for their electricity. And one of the things in that is, we're seeing it already in Ireland, we buy services long relative to food. In other words, I pay my electricity bill every 2 months. Okay, if I have a choice, tomorrow, feed the family, pay the bill, I'll kind of put off the bill. Okay, that is that, remember that circle we showed, the time horizon. When it gets tighter, it starts to retract. You come closer to the family, closer in time. You look after the present more than the future. So down goes your investment, and then you get this situation. Spending falls, but you have to pay the operational cost for the whole system. So the cost per unit starts to rise for each user that is left. More drop out, and the cost rises again because you've got to pay the fixed costs. And once your fixed costs can't be paid for by the people, it doesn't matter that people are still buying electricity, it's just unviable. So, boom, down it goes. Okay? Likewise, your IT infrastructure. We're all using it, a little bit here, a little bit there. It's built for our scale. If it had been built for India's scale, we could probably deal with it longer. But it's not. It's built for us and our big bandwidth and all of that. And basically, we can't afford either components like mobile phones and computers start to get more expensive, or they might get cheaper if they, actually probably get cheaper, but our use of them in terms of where there's a cost starts to get less and less. But the system is viable. My phone system is viable because it has its wide network availability. If less and less are using it, or we're all sharing the phone to use at an odd time for very important occasions, and we're not working because we've all lost our jobs, well, then, again, the same dynamic, fewer and fewer people are using it. Prices rise per user for the fixed costs, and out it goes. So that, then, is the individual part of the infrastructure, but we saw it's highly coupled. So they start to knock each other over. So the grid goes down, and you start to have sewage backing up, and you can't clean it, and you don't have water, or problems with water leading to other problems. Actually, before I do that, there's one more thing which, again, as I said, the slides weren't finished on this because it's an older thing that I was actually fixing up here earlier on because the other stuff went away. Remember I mentioned about employment and food. What's the difference between the Great Depression and us now? Well, in the Great Depression, there were lots of people, say 25%, producing food without lots of fancy inputs. Relatively easy to manage. We have in America, there's about 5% of people involved in energy and food with loads of inputs that they rely on. So if all we're spending is just to be food, and a bit of debt servicing and a bit of this, that, and the other, what do we all do? Our jobs vanish, vaporize. Okay? And it's all right to think we could all be back in the fields. Yes, we probably all have to get back into the fields. But that's not something that happens on a Tuesday morning. That is a vast cultural thing. It's people moving. It's people, it's a huge thing. So that effectively, there's no economy left. And if you add to the supply chain risks, that actually just suddenly starts to make us both unfunctional in the roles we were in, pretty unadapted to whatever we're going to do. Where are we as a society? Where are they living in urban places? And even as, I don't know if any of you know a website called Zone 5. But it's Guy Graham Strout, who's a permaculture guy, lives down in West Cork in Ireland. And he makes the point that, look, he said, I'm a very good permaculture food grower. I have loads of skills. It would be a hell of a stretch for me, on my own, to keep myself going through 160 days of the year and around the other side, having to supply my own seeds and all of that. In other words, real things. He's more or less near the very top of people, of the skill level for that. Where are the rest of us? And you can say, yes, community, but this is the best in the community. Everybody else is going to be way down. In fact, most will just be wildered. So this, again, comes back, it reminds us about complementary currencies. Why do complementary currencies work? Well, there's two things. One is, if you have a hard currency out here, complementary currencies can allow you to have some economic activity and local economic activity, and that hardness allows you to bring in things from the outside fixed, stable world. If the outside fixed, stable world starts to go haywire in terms of money, and all you're left with is what you have locally, making a local currency will not make you food, will not give you skills. It's not that in the future we may not have local currencies, but in the interim, that idea is we're not producing, we are not those people. And here is the next, so that's as we see this convergence of things. And the final thing, and I'll conclude, is Now, this is really simplified, but I kind of find it one of the more sort of things.